Welcome to the This Week in Clean Tech podcast. Each week we speak to a leading CEO, executive, thought leader or insider in the clean tech sector. Each guest shares their thoughts on recent events, their own clean tech story and their vision and hopes for the future. This week our host David Hunt is talking with Toddington Harper, CEO of GRIDSERVE. Toddington is an experienced clean energy entrepreneur, executive and investor with more than 16 years of CEO experience across 5 sustainable energy companies. Toddington has developed and built over 350 megawatts of solar and battery projects in the UK, generating in excess of £200 million in revenues. And that's enough from me. Let's hand it over to David with our guest for this week, Toddington Harper.
Good afternoon, Toddington. Thanks very much for joining us on this week's This Week in Clean Tech podcast. It's great to have you with us.
Great to be here, David.
Okay, so I'm very keen to explore the recent announcement of the subsidy projects, solar and storage projects for Warrington Borough Council. But although your background is extensive more than most in terms of the renewable sector and clean tech, are you able to share a little bit of what brought you to this point in your clean tech journey?
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, my journey, the journey that I am on, in terms of clean tech, happened from essentially when I was born and actually prior to being born, because I'm actually a second generation solar and battery person. There aren't very many of them around.
No, not at all.
My father, so we grew up in the Middle East, in Bahrain, and my father devised really some of the world's first commercial deployments of solar systems, which were for Saudi Aramco, the oil company, quite ironically.
Right.
To provide an alternative to diesel generation in the deserts of Saudi around 45 years ago. That was at a time where solar panels were, we did a calculation recently, we reckon roughly 99.6% or so more expensive than they are today. Which is really astonishing. He was buying in dollars what we buy in cents for now.
Yeah.
And in fact, quite a lot more than that. It was very close to $80 a watt peak, and today sub 30 cents, which is pretty amazing. But the reason that he made it work is a very long story short. In fact, quite ironically, or I'm just not sure how the universe is going to come together. But my father at one point was also building petrol stations in the UK.
Right.
And I'm Toddington. I'm actually named after a service station, Toddington Services, on the M1, as is my brother Heston. So I'm not quite sure, but the universe seems to be telling me that I need to be doing what I'm doing.
Back to petrol, or forecourts at least. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. He would be quite pleased about this. Unfortunately, he's not around anymore. But yeah, he was building a lot of petrol stations, many years ago, and then the oil crisis came. He cast off, thought it was all about sustainable energy, ended up quite randomly in the deserts of Saudi, actually deserts of Abu Dhabi, building eco homes, and then discovered solar energy, and actually worked out because he could see people in the desert, these huge lorry loads of continuous tankers that were required in the desert to provide diesel and also maintenance for diesel generators, which is you need a little bit of power to stop the oil pipelines corroding. It's called cathodic protection, and this was provided by diesel generators in the desert. And my father kind of came to the conclusions that was a very expensive and difficult thing to do. And even with solar energy more expensive, or as expensive as it was then, he worked out that if he could combine it with battery storage, he could provide an alternative application, an alternative way of powering the application than diesel generators. And actually took it to Aramco, and they went with it and delivered 700 or so systems, 45 years ago. And to the best of our knowledge, we think they was probably the first, certainly amongst the first commercial deployments of solar anywhere. So, kind of in answer to your question, I was then born a few years later, and the first thing I knew in terms of energy was solar. We had my father was also an engineer. Our television in Bahrain in the Middle East was again, it was a battery, but powered by a little wind turbine. And I always used to know when it was too windy because my dad's electronics was a little bit shaky. And when the wind was quite strong, the television used to kind of like blur. You have these black kind of wobbly triangle lines that used to come on it. And I thought, oh, I guess it's windy today. So yeah, I mean, that was kind of my life. And it was only really when I actually still remember it. It was quite weird. I was in a geography lesson at school when I was about 9. At one point, my parents decided I needed to get a proper education, so they removed me from this little kind of desert paradise that I'd been brought up in, and stuck me in boarding school around about 9 years old. And I remember being in a geography lesson, and they started talking about how how the world is powered, which of course up until that point I was pretty clear it was clearly going to be renewable energy because that was
Yeah.
just obvious. Obviously, it would be done by that, but much to my amazement, they told me that actually the world was powered by fossil fuels, and I just thought that was very strange.
Yeah, that's certainly a background more than most. I thought I was quite pleased with the fact I started about 2007 when solar was about sort of £2.80, £2.90 a watt, but that certainly supersedes that. I think the first PV out of Bell Labs was about 1955. So, like you say, certainly very early projects that your father was involved with.
Yeah, yeah, he was really at the forefront of it, and and actually, it was quite interesting because many years later, I mean, I built a number of different businesses. I guess probably in reality, I've thought about this a while, and people are like, "What's the urge you have to focus on sustainability and renewable energy?" Because that's kind of what I've done my whole career. Although, I actually, if I'd have followed my father's footsteps, it would have been a bit easier. But I guess I went round the houses and did lots of other routes before I came back to solar and batteries.
Right.
But I think when people say what drives you to do this, I just kind of think I'd quite like to get back to that little happy place that I always knew when I was born, that the world was powered by things I could understand,
Yeah.
rather than what I learned in that geography lesson. And it all made a lot more sense up until that point. Um,
Sure.
and actually, so I did quite a lot of work. And it does connect again a bit later, which I'll come into. But I ended up doing quite a lot of work building a platform, first of all in the fuel cell industry called Fuel Cell Markets, to sort of pull this new energy marketplace together. I then built a wider platform called Low Carbon Economy, to sort of connect this jigsaw of low carbon economy, and that culminated in a project with the United Nations, with UNEP, the United Nations Environment Programme, and we started attending the COP events, the United Nations climate change
Yep.
events, and essentially what we were trying to do was pull together all the different solutions that are required to help people transition quicker to a low carbon economy. And eventually we got to the Copenhagen COP. It was 2009, if I remember rightly, and that was the one where everyone was going to sign a big agreement.
Yeah.
And it was a funny period because about a few weeks before this story had broken, broken, clearly very well planned. I don't know if you remember. Do you remember something called Climate Gate that hit the media? University of East Anglia
That's right.
climate
Yeah. With the climate
scientists.
data. Yeah.
Yeah, these evil scientists were hacking, data and manipulating data to serve their budgets, and this kind of crazy story came out, and it came out, with a name at the same time, Climate Gate, and it was clearly the whole thing was designed to try and provide disruption, and
Yeah.
ultimately to give politicians, concern that actually the science around climate change was proven. Actually it wasn't proven anymore because these scientists who told you that it was were actually just manipulating it for their own needs. It sounds a bit silly, really, but it worked very well, and it was actually, I think, a decision that politicians would try. It was a very difficult decision at the time, to sign up to an agreement, to mitigate climate change, because in 2009, as you said in your point before, renewable energy was extremely expensive. And so if you were saying to a country, you need to decarbonize your economy, you were basically saying you needed to transition to energy sources that were more expensive than the fossil fuel sources that typically people were relying on. And so if you sort of feed that through, that meant that your underlying economy, was going to be, the energy cost was going to be greater, and therefore
Yeah.
you're going to be less competitive, and it's going to cost you a lot of money ultimately. So by saying at that point in time you need to cut carbon, is ultimately means that you need to mitigate growth, or make your economies
Damage
less
your economy.
competitive.
Yeah.
Yeah,
It's
and
amazing
that's
how much we've evolved in the last 10 years. As you said, it is just 10 years, and the world's a very different place. By no means resolved, but certainly a very different place than it was then.
yeah, for sure. I mean, it's yeah, totally, and fundamentally, I think what's changed in the last few years, which is actually why I decided to do that, is that it's no longer expensive to generate energy from renewable energy sources. In fact, it's cleaner. And that was my conclusions from Copenhagen. I got to the point, I thought, the whole thing fell apart. They wouldn't make those expensive decisions. People weren't, prepared to put GDP at risk. It was too difficult, commitment from politicians. There was too many people pushing the other direction. And up until that point, I'd been connecting the jigsaw together, and I thought, I just don't think the jigsaw's quite ready to be connected together, because there's this fundamental problem that people aren't going to do things that are going to cost them lots of money.
Yeah.
So I thought, well, I need to stop, focusing my energy in that direction. I need to really focus on what the problem is here, and the problem is, the point that we were making, that we need to be able to produce renewable energy cheaper than fossil fuels. Because if you get to that point, then politicians will gladly stamp it. They'll say they're doing it for all the right reasons, get lots of kudos, when fundamentally it's an easy decision to make, because it will generate GDP as opposed to the opposite. So my background in looking at all these different technologies was really useful, because I had a good understanding of what was out there and the costs of different solutions, and came to conclusions very quickly that solar was the one that was on the path for cost reductions the fastest.
Right.
And actually within solar, there was a particular technology called thin film. And that was the one that required less carbon and less energy to produce it, and less costs. And so that was the one that was on the greatest cost reduction curve, in my opinion. And there was a company that I'd met called Beck Energy at an event. I'd actually met them at the World Future Energy Summit in Abu Dhabi. Again, it's like the world connecting again. And I went knocking on their door, and I said, hello, I'd really like to work with you guys, because you're experts in thin film technology, and for reasons that are probably more important to me than anyone else on the planet. I'd really like to help you and that technology succeed. And they were like, oh, okay. And this is a German company, not very well known at the time. And they said, well, if you really want to help us, then we're thinking about setting up a UK arm. And why don't you do that with us? So I thought, okay, we'll do it. And it seemed like a good idea to do. I didn't expect that opportunity. Created the company, and actually couple of months later, the company rebranded as BELECTRIC.
Yep.
And then a couple of months after that, a survey came out of the top 650 biggest solar businesses in the world, EPCs in the world, and much to my and I think everyone's amazement, we discovered that BELECTRIC was the world market leader. Which was really quite interesting. And actually, they'd got to that position of being world market leader because they had thin film and that and supply contracts for it that allowed them to deliver, and have a real competitive edge.
Yeah.
So all of a sudden, I found myself as a director of the UK arm of the biggest solar company in the world, and I thought, okay, I better sort this out. And went and gave myself a proper job title. I became CEO, and together with other colleagues who we'd started with, we really started building the business. And it was a very exciting journey. We lived through the whole subsidy journey.
Yeah.
We built an entirely vertically integrated company, from developing sites, right the way through to then EPC, building them out, and then operating and maintaining them. It was a real adventure. And
Certainly a bumpy road, living through that those early 2000s, so sort of 2010 through 14, with various, obviously in the UK in itself, but globally there was a lot of policy changes back and forth that moved the solar market globally, and obviously the UK was in the spotlight for a while, but it was far from steady.
God, wasn't it just? Yeah, it was pretty nuts, and it was pretty nuts because it was all dominated on subsidies. I mean, fundamentally, the solar power was so expensive, at least at the beginning of that journey, that the only way you could build projects was if you could get a guaranteed subsidy. But those subsidies were in the hands of politicians, which changed fairly frequently and had different opinions about how much they favored or didn't favor, or solar against any other technologies.
Yeah.
And that resulted in some pretty crazy market distortions. The first one, which was nuts, was that the subsidies would typically change annually, although they didn't always, but they always changed typically annually, and at the end of March.
Yeah,
Which
I
meant
recall many frantic Februaries.
yeah, which meant everyone was covered in mud. We were like digging and covered in mud and machinery. So everyone building everything through the winter, scrabbling. It was just the opposite of what you really should be doing, because you're trying to hit a moving target.
Yeah.
Um, and um, and uh, and it was it was extremely exciting. We managed to do rather well. There were some companies that didn't manage to hit that target, and through missing subsidies by a few days, that was the end of their businesses, and it was a very bumpy, very very bumpy period, but extremely educational, and what resulted in it was entities like people like myself and entities like ours, learning the trade, learning the skills, driving down cost, and really ultimately getting to the really achieving the purpose of what subsidies were designed to do in the first place, which was bring down the cost to the point you didn't need them anymore.
Sure. You
Which is
put
where
quite
we
a few
ended up.
megawatts in the ground, didn't you?
Sorry?
You put quite a few megawatts in the ground in the UK over a
We,
relatively short period of time.
we developed and built around 350 megawatts. We weren't able to build everything at the time that we developed, but we certainly deployed hundreds of megawatts in the ground. We also put quite a few megawatts on rooftops. The last rooftop we did was a 3.42 megawatt system on Rolls-Royce in Bristol. That was a pretty amazing project. And we learned a huge amount. In fact, the funny thing was as well, I said I'd come back to it, that the first project that we built was a 5 megawatt thin film project using panels called Solar Frontier.
Yeah.
And the funny thing about that was that I discovered after we'd built the project that Solar Frontier, after my dad's business, solar business, was acquired 40 odd years ago by Siemens, they then sold it to Shell. Shell kept the thin film piece, which became Solar Frontier, and then spun out the crystalline piece, which became Solar World. So quite randomly, I discovered that I'd actually installed a commercial version of what my father had been playing around with many, many years before, which was really funny. But beyond thin film, the bit that I didn't really anticipate, I don't think anyone really anticipated, is quite how much of an impact the Chinese manufacturing would bring to the equation by building these enormous projects, as enormous manufacturing facilities to service very large projects. Really, what we found is that the costs of crystalline panels just dropped and dropped and dropped
Plummeted.
and dropped and
Yeah.
dropped. So when the dust settled, and it really was a bit like that, the dust settling, all of a sudden we were in a new era. We didn't have a subsidy, but actually the cost of solar was now, it wasn't expensive anymore. It wasn't even a medium cost. It was a low cost technology, which was a very exciting place to be. And that was why I was very, very confident that we would be able to achieve, what we've actually just achieved with the launch recently of the first, non-subsidy solar projects to be built at this sort of scale since 2016.
Yeah, in the UK, which is remarkable. So I guess that final piece of the jigsaw, you exited BELECTRIC, and then sort of the evolution of GRIDSERVE, which I believe is the genesis, at least, of a family business again.
Well, we sold the business to Innogy, RWE Innogy in 2016, December 2016. They acquired the whole of the BELECTRIC group. Traditional energy business. Obviously appreciated that the world was changing, and that, a good opportunity for them to get into solar was to acquire a very successful solar business, which we had one of them. And at that time, what they essentially bought was a strong operation and maintenance business, which we'd built up. But the actual deal that I struck originally with my colleagues in Germany was that they would educate me on the business of solar power, and I would build the business. And so, together with some early founder kind of colleagues, that's exactly what we did. And so we actually hosted the business in our office. So it's a family office, and employed all the people from the UK, so that once we'd, the ultimate result of that is that once we'd ended up selling the business to Innogy, a lot of people really wanted to come back and reform, and actually we used the same company that did at one point own 49% of BELECTRIC, or up until the sale to Innogy. We basically turned that company from a holding company into an operating company, renamed it GRIDSERVE, and that was the start. GRIDSERVE is now part of a larger group of companies that make up the kind of the overall structure. But that's where it came from, and so it's run out of the same office that we run BELECTRIC from, because that was our office.
Yeah.
Many of the key team members are the same people that we lived this journey through. But the real advantage that we had is that because the market had kind of fragmented after the subsidy era, we had an opportunity to really to kind of bring in some additional people that I'd met along the journey, who are absolutely brilliant respectively in their different areas, to kind of complement the core skills that we already had. And it was a combination of these new talent with the existing people that we had, the learning, the base of a great office and infrastructure, and the fundamental belief that we could make this work. That allowed us to do what we've just announced, and actually, positions us extremely well for the future, we think.
Sure. Yeah. Okay. So that's another. Solar has come down, as you say, to be extremely one of the cheapest forms of energy. But then the whole energy transition is evolving, and energy storage in terms of batteries, and of course electric vehicles. And I know you're a long-time EV driver, are sort of into both the opportunities and the challenges. The projects that we'll talk about now, actually, with the Warrington Borough Council, there's storage at least on one of those sites. Is that right?
Yeah, well, we expect it will be on both sites as well, but just doing a slightly different purpose. So, the fundamental building blocks is that when we got to the end of subsidies, the actual income stream from a solar farm project was the majority of it was actually from the merchant power price. There was still a minority piece from a subsidy, and that was a useful minority piece because everybody knew what the value of that energy would be, irrespective of when you kind of produced it, which was very helpful. And so, but we then left the subsidy era, and that piece went, and so you still had the merchant power piece, but you didn't have the subsidy piece, and that kind of creates a couple of issues. One is that you need to be sure what the price, or you need to have a good set of defensible positions for the merchant power price over its lifetime, and you also need to make up for the fact that you've lost a piece of uncertain revenue, a piece of certain revenue, sorry. And ways to do that are to substitute it for alternative revenue sources, but really you want to increase the amount of revenue and optionality as much as possible to also make up for the certainty that you've lost. So we really kind of took it all apart, and actually the secret to what we're doing isn't really much of a secret, because we're talking about it, and actually we stuck it in our name, GRIDSERVE. Because fundamentally the funny thing about the whole sort of subsidy era is that unlike the stuff that my dad was doing 45 years ago, when he was combining solar and batteries to service this kind of critical application that was really valuable, the subsidy era, people quite ironically didn't really spend a great deal of time thinking about what happened to the energy that was being produced, or the value of that energy. People were just very much focused on subsidies, and a market sort of projection curve for the rest of it. And you produced the energy at whatever time as cost effectively as possible. It went into the grid, and it was kind of like job done. We're helping the UK to meet its targets, which is a very natural response to the subsidies that were in place. But of course, if we're going to move beyond, which we clearly need to, beyond where we are at the moment, where 25 or 30% now of our energy is produced from renewable energy sources, to 100%, which is ultimately where we need to get to mitigate the worst effects of climate change and secure our economy, and to do all sorts of, to progress, and also in the process, also manage a huge amount of electric vehicles, which are going to create additional strain and stress on the grid. Then you can't just do what we did, in the subsidy era. You have to, you can't just build a project which produces energy at any time because you know how much value you're going to get from it, 'cause there's an artificial prop. You have to really ensure that what you're doing is as useful as it can possibly be, and that makes you think a lot more. And that's kind of what we do. I mean, the fundamental is you can't, if you're going to physically be able to produce 100% of your energy from low carbon sources, of which a backbone will be renewables, then your projects have to be part of the solution. It just can't be somebody else's problem anymore.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And there was always a battle between developers and the grid and the DNOs, because, as you say, we had sort of kind of mixed drivers, and I know a number of people sort of looked forward very much, my previous business included, to sort of a subsidy-free day when you could actually be a lot more holistic about solutions and not just driven by the money piece or whatever it happened to be.
Yeah, I mean, subsidy free is definitely the right word. Free of subsidies. I mean, it is a bit of a eureka moment to not have to be tied to something that's completely outside your control, that could change any time, and ultimately result in you having to run your business according to that, as opposed to according to how it ideally should best be done. And energy storage is a fundamental, it is the fundamental changer and enabler in this space, because it allows you to ultimately, well, it allows you to do a lot of things. It allows you to shift that energy into periods of where it's highest, of greater value. You can stop producing energy when it's at periods of low value, at least stop in terms of the effect on the grid.
Yeah.
um, and in addition to that, it allows you to provide a whole host of services that can help the grid. Whether it's short-term frequency response, or it's controlling voltage on the grid through reactive power,
Yeah.
or worst case scenario, restarting the grid in a black start scenario if things haven't really gone according to plan, or whatever it might be. It's extremely useful. And so really what we've done with Warrington is we had to really start again, and we had to think, oh, okay, we know fundamentally we're going to make this work, because ultimately the energy is a low cost energy source, and therefore we know the odds are in our favor.
Yeah.
But to make it stack up, we need to ensure that we maximize the value that we are delivering here in essentially every way we can. And what we ended up doing is we said, well, okay, there's ways we can do that on site, and there's ways we can do that off site. So on site, the first part of the jigsaw is to say, well, okay, how can we make as much energy as possible from that given area without proportionally increasing the costs in the same way. And that's when we thought, well, we saw a great opportunity for bifacial panels,
Right. Yeah.
which is just a no-brainer. I mean, it's basically the same cell with a treated cell on the back as well as the front. You have a clear back sheet, so light can enter the back as well, and that means you can just, with the same panel and essentially the same cost, or certainly very very close to the same cost, you can generate a lot more energy.
You
And
say that, but it's relatively uncommon, to say the least, for bifacial modules at this time, at least, to be on such a large project.
Well, it depends where you are in the world. So, yes, in England, it's definitely not common. This is the first. These are the first of their type in the UK. But if you go, abroad and look at, huge, there's gigawatts of these projects being installed worldwide this year. Huge projects in China, in the US, and so on. And we're pretty sure that this will be the de facto standard, because where we've got to in terms of the sort of cost reduction curve of solar is, I mean, we're very close with the economies of scale to the actual raw material cost,
Yeah.
plus the actual cost of processing to make a panel. So where the additional cost savings come from is in increases in performance and efficiency and generation. And so it really is a no-brainer in our opinion to take a panel for the similar type of manufacturing cost, and then able to and allow it to absorb really a significant amount of additional energy.
Yeah.
And that ultimately produces the levelized cost of energy, which is clearly what we want to achieve. So yes, it's not common yet, but my hypothesis, and it's always dangerous doing this on something that was recorded, but I would say 3 years from now, possibly a lot earlier than that, it will be the absolute standard in certainly large scale utility solar farm, and probably many solar farms, and probably many other applications as well.
Yeah.
The second thing, which was another, it kind of follows the same discussion as the last point about bifacials, but another not known fact for the UK that we looked at was trackers.
Mm-hmm.
So, to our knowledge, there have been no large-scale tracker projects delivered in the UK. Of course, again, worldwide, gigawatts this year. In fact,
Yeah.
gigawatts in the last few years. But actually, the reason that we didn't start with trackers because of the energy yield. That's a kind of like an advantage, but it wasn't the fundamental advantage from our side. We started it because we were trying to work out how to reduce the energy price risk of the energy that we were producing
Right. Okay. Yeah. So you could spread the generation
throughout
throughout
the
the
day.
course of the day.
Exactly. So like south-facing solar panels, which is I think pretty much what all the solar farms in the UK, 10 gigawatts or so are today. They produce most of their output, or they're designed at least to produce most of their output towards the midday period, which is great if you've got a subsidy, and it doesn't really matter as much the value of that energy. But if you don't have a subsidy, then it's a reasonable case to assume that not just your solar project, but everyone else's is producing the maximum amount at that particular time if it's a really sunny day. So the market is potentially oversupplied, at least by solar, which has the greatest chance, in a supply and demand scenario, which is a fluid energy market like we have in the UK, to mean that prices could potentially drop, and drop potentially significantly. And that's, whilst that's not necessarily going to always happen, because solar energy is only a part of the energy mix, and of course there's a number of other pieces as well, it is definitely, it's definitely a real consideration. And so we were thinking, well, how do we get around this? And obviously, one way is you put a really big battery in, and that allows you to shift the energy throughout the day. But that's quite expensive, and it leads to more use of the battery, which can degrade the battery faster, and it's just a high capex way to look at it. But then we looked at trackers. We thought, well, that's actually it kind of does it already. And in fact, not only does it do it, but we don't have to look at losing energy. We could look at gaining energy, because there's going to be an increased yield as well. So I mean, and the curve is quite a funny one. It looks a bit like a molar tooth. So you get higher energy production in the morning. It kind of drops slightly at midday, because our solar panels are on a horizontal axis. So at 12 o'clock, they are flat as opposed to being inclined to the sun, which means that the energy drops slightly, and then it picks up again in the afternoon, which is kind of the exact curve that you want, in as opposed to the standard
traditional dot curve,
traditional bell
curve,
So that was quite cool. And then we discovered there was another advantage on top of that, because bifacial panels work by absorbing diffuse light. And if you can, by using a tracker, you can open up the back of the solar panel to increased light, which is what happens, then you're likely to increase the bifacial gain too. So we thought, wow, this is really what we need. It answers the fundamentals that we're looking for. So that was kind of like the first few optimizations. What we then did, though, is we said, well, in addition to that, what else are we not using on the site that we could use better? And of course, grid connections are very expensive, and they're typically optimized for export, maximum export. But you're actually maximum export, you're using it maybe 15% or less of the time. So we thought, well, okay, what else can we do with that grid connection? And we decided to also add we were able to get an import connection too, which is very helpful. So now we can use that grid connection as an asset itself, independent of the solar farm, actually, or in harmony, all of it together. So, to give you an example, you could, let's just say it's a really sunny day, the price of energy drops at 12 o'clock. You can use that battery just to store that energy and push it out maybe at 7 o'clock at night, for example. But let's say it's the same night, it's a very windy night, the price of energy, drops again at night because there's lots of wind, or maybe it even goes negative, super. We can now use that import connection to charge our battery.
Okay,
And we can push it out in the morning peak, and we can also provide voltage control. We can, through reactive power, we can provide all these different services, which is really, really helpful as well. So, so a combination between all these different points is we're able to increase generation, we're able to increase income, we diversify income from having a combination of different income streams. And that, and we got to the point of saying, actually, these more than, in our opinion, offset what we lost at the end of the subsidy era. So that was a big tick. And then the last kind of piece, which is where really, it came together with Warrington, is that they're clearly an extremely forward-thinking council. Huge respect for the guys there, and they were clearly grappling, or in fact, are grappling, as I understand, are all, if not many, many if not all councils across the UK, grappling with these huge austerity cuts that have happened in the last 5 years or so. And huge budget reductions have been pushed onto councils which have directly contributed to drops in being able to maintain frontline services. I think we hear about street lamps literally being turned off because you can't afford to power them, and so you find Warrington kind of grappling with this issue of we have to maintain essential services. In fact, we want to do more than that. We want to we want to go further and actually deliver urban regeneration, but we've got less money to do it. So what can we do? And they were so they were looking at what we do in a different way. So for example, one of the projects, Hull, so there's two projects we're delivering them at 60.4 megawatt peak in total. They will own both of them once they're built. We're building them first and then transferring when they're built. And Hull, they will also have a sleeving contract, which will provide 100% of the electricity for all council buildings, as well as street lights, as well as many primary schools. And that's a really big tick for them because ultimately they're still paying for that energy, but they pay a special purpose vehicle through an intermediary, which they own and ultimately receive the income back from, which is really clever. And it also means that they know what their price of energy is going to be in 30 years time, because they own it, and effectively that's what you get in a solar farm. The energy falls on a day-to-day basis, but you know how much you're going to have through the next 30 years. So for them, it's like part of it was de-risking future costs of energy, part of it was saving energy from their existing energy supply, but of course, in addition to that, the projects make money, and they make money both with the sleeving contract and also with the one which doesn't, which is the York project, which has the large battery, first phase. Then that's a merchant type PPA, so it's not particularly special in that regard, and which is also quite helpful because that can then be replicated into other councils as well. The advantage there is that along with Hull, the project also generates income, and that's fundamentally what the council are looking at it. So if you're just a pure equity type investor and you're sort of saying, well, am I happy with this return or am I happy with that return? Well, that depends on the mandate of your fund. If you are a council and you're saying, oh, I need to maintain public services and I need to I'd like to deliver urban regeneration for people in my council, is this going to make me money that will allow me to do that? Yes, it will. Is it going to make me significant money? Yes, it will. And their projections that the two projects will deliver them 150 million pounds to pay for council services and urban generation over the lifetime, and that's a big number. And but they analyze it very differently. They're not saying I need this IRR or that IRR. They're saying, like, I want to keep the lights on and I want to do this.
Yeah, it's still very forward thinking. I think obviously Nottingham, I think in the past, and Bristol have been relatively forward thinking in deploying solar for different reasons and at different times. But even so, even though those numbers make sense, it's still pretty innovative for a council to see it in that way and to make that investment and to enable these projects. As you say, I think it's a big hats off to the guys in Warrington.
Big hats off. And I think another thing for people who are doing this not just for the money, but also because we think it's the right thing to do, and I definitely put GRIDSERVE in that camp. When we're sort of looking at things like the Paris Agreement and how we mitigate and how we transfer our economy to one based on low carbon sources, as opposed to where we are today, then it's a huge achievement because Warrington could say, well, actually, we're a council and we produce 100% of our energy from clean sources, and we do it now. We'd have to wait till 2030, 2040. And I just think that's such a big, that's such a big thing that, and they do it in a way that, makes them money and it just ticks lots of boxes. So yes, incredibly. That's why I started with, I take my hat off for them because they're really forward thinking. But equally, it wasn't an easy ride. We've had, as I said, that they're getting the projects when they're completed. So we're getting the projects bank financed again. I think it's another first. So bank finance, the first projects to be non-subsidy and also bank financed in the country. And obviously, when you're getting banks to finance projects, they really do put you through your paces. So huge numbers of law firms, technical advisors, you name it, have gone through and looked at everything. And actually, we feel really happy about that. Because it just means that everybody involved knows that there's a lot of people that really know what they're talking about, that have had a really good dig into all of this, and so it comes with a big tick, which is we're obviously really happy about that.
Yeah.
So overall it's quite a big thing, and above and beyond that, there's actually a bit more to it, which is that beyond these projects that we're developing, that generate ultimately energy and help the grid in the process, we're also focused on tackling this other issue or opportunity, whichever way you want to call it, related to electric vehicles. And you're right, I've been driving an electric vehicle now for 5 years, and it's been epic. 5 years ago, the infrastructure just didn't really exist. I did run out. It happened quite a lot. It was very hairy. It was the most expensive thing I'd bought ever at that point in time, was an electric car, and so I made a commitment to my wife, that in fact, wife to be, I think, was in a situation that I would. That we would undertake any journey anymore, and it was fine. It wasn't going to. We didn't need another car as well. It was fine. We were going to do everything, and that was a pretty crazy thing, because we lived through it together. And then she told me it soon after. She said, "Toddington, you do realise we're going to France in a couple of weeks?" And I was like, "Oh my goodness." Okay, well, I guess we're doing it. It was really funny. I was quite lucky. I was able to get a Tesla, which again I managed to get. I managed to pay for it off building a quite a large project. It was called Landmead, which is it was the largest project in the UK in 2014, which 46 megawatt was quite a big thing at the time. But in 2014 there really wasn't the infrastructure, so I rung up Tesla and I said, right, I've got to drive to Montpellier in France in like 2 weeks' time, and I've noticed you're putting up chargers, but do they work? I've also noticed there's big gaps. I've been thinking that there's an IKEA here, and I think there's this here. And they were like, "You're doing what?" I said, yeah, I'm going to Montpellier. They were like, I'm not sure you can do that, Mr. Harper. And I said, well, I'm doing it, and I'm doing it in 2 weeks. If you're gonna help, I'd love to know. So I got a call back. This is when I first realised what an amazing company they are. I got a call back in about a week, and they said, Toddington, we're going to open up a charger early for you, because you just won't make it otherwise. And they did. There was one in Reims or Reims, I'm not quite sure how you pronounce it, Reims, just above Paris, and they opened that up. And actually, I'm pleased they did, because my other plan was an IKEA, and I couldn't find the charger there anyway. So I'm very pleased they did.
That's sort of the problem. I mean, they're a company that inspire, love and hate in equal measure, it would seem, but certainly have done a phenomenal amount for moving e-mobility forward, as we're seeing on a daily basis now. I'm conscious a little bit of time, but I wanted to, because I know the sort of electric forecourt, moving on to this sort of e-mobility and grid services is quite important to you personally and to the company. Could you share a little bit about that briefly?
Yeah, sure. So essentially, everything that we've learnt about that I've learnt about driving an electric car, the vehicles themselves are awesome. The infrastructure is, has a lot to be desired. All of that is what we're putting into this generation of electric forecourts that we're developing and we're building out within the next, from this year onwards. And our bar is very high, in the same way that we think electric vehicles are really infinitely better in so many ways than combustion vehicles. And I find very few people who have if I don't know anybody who says I've got an electric car and I've gone back.
No.
But the infrastructure itself is pretty hairy still. And again, our plan is to do the reverse. Our plan is to make the infrastructure just infinitely better and easier than even petrol infrastructure is today. And that's what we plan to do. And all of the experience and all of the knowledge that we have over the years, we're putting in. And of course, we're not just building the infrastructure itself, but we're also going to be generating the energy, so that people can be absolutely sure that 100% of the energy that's being consumed, whether it's directly on site or off site and fed into the grid and pulled out somewhere else, is 100% clean energy, because that's also very, very important.
Yeah, and very important to most people who have made the commitment to drive an EV is to make it as clean as possible in its operation.
Yeah, absolutely. And in about a month or so, we will be saying quite a lot more about that.
Okay. All right. We could to perhaps get you back, or certainly to explore those announcements as they come through. And that's one of the amazing things about the clean tech and renewable sector is that, it's certainly in the last number of years, there's almost daily an announcement or an evolution in terms of e-mobility or renewables. And these projects are fascinating. We'll certainly put details of the projects onto the podcast episode page for those who want to explore further, the listeners who wish to do that, and we'll make sure those links are present. I think I really appreciate your time, Toddington, so far. It's been an interesting journey. One thing I tend to like to close with, as someone who is deeply embedded in the sector, is to see if there are any either books, podcasts, thought leaders, or mentors, or people who've been really instrumental or had the greatest impact on you in the last few years. Clearly, in your early life, you had your father, but more recently, have there been any sort of inspirations or sources that you return to?
Gosh, wow, that's a question. There's about 7 books that I've read in my life that have changed my life hugely. Probably the most, interesting of all of these is a book that was written about 100 years ago called Think and Grow Rich. That has for sure changed my life.
Napoleon Hill, know it well.
Napoleon Hill, yeah. I think some people get a bit put off by the title Grow Rich because they think it's all about money, but it's not about money. Richness can be perceived in many, many ways. Money is one of them, but having a fantastic, fulfilling life is a big part of it. And basically that book gives you the power to ultimately do whatever you want and however you perceive richness to achieve it. So I would say above everything else, that's probably the book. And if you have time at some time, I can tell you, an almost out-of-worldly experience, which is what brought me that book in the first place. But that would require a whole another podcast.
I'm just actually halfway through his previous book, actually, which was the 16 sort of steps to success, which is clearly part of the journey before he wrote that particular book. But certainly we'll add a link to.
I think he interviewed the most successful self-made people in the world for 27 years. Until he, because he was given this, he was kind of put on this mission by then the most successful self-made person in the world, and I think it took him 27 years to hear the stories and then write the book, and all of that knowledge from the most amazing people and successful people, self-started, that had ever lived, is in that book. And so that would be my tip to in answer to your question. And of course there's people like Elon Musk who just his car is just amazing, and what they're doing is incredible, and I do think he gets a lot of grief from people, but I think probably a big part of that as well is just because it's steps ahead.
Yeah, I think you always, if you are, disturbing the status quo, you're always going to get some resistance, which he clearly continues to get. But the biography, which was out I think last year or the year before, was very good. I thought. I don't know if you had a chance to read that.
I haven't yet, but my brother has, and I haven't really talked much about my brother, but he lives in the other side of the world and actually runs another part of our business focus on critical, same sort of kit that we're talking about, but for the telecoms industry, which is kind of a legacy from what my dad worked out. He's read the book and he loves it.
Sure. Okay. Well, listen, I appreciate your time. It'd be great, seeing as there's such a depth of experience, to perhaps invite you back at some time in the future to talk more about the forecourts and the e-mobility transition. But for now, I think it's been really fascinating. I appreciate your time. We'll put the links up on the podcast, as a webpage, in terms of the particular project in Warrington and GRIDSERVE. But appreciate your time today, Toddington.
Super. Likewise. Thanks for having me. All the best.
Thank you for joining us again on the This Week in Clean Tech podcast. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and if so, please do share it with friends, colleagues, and on any social media platforms. Next week, David will be in Berlin and Dusseldorf, where he'll be speaking with Philip Schroeder, CEO of investment company Cap Inside and former executive with Zonnen, recently acquired by Shell and Tesla Europe. We look forward to you joining us then.